So now we're going to go ahead and work through some more of 1.6. Before break, we talked about rational equations and how to solve those. We've got a couple of different types to work through next. These are going to be the square roots we're going to focus on now. So we're going to learn how to solve square root equations. Step number 1 is isolate the root. And usually we'll put that root on the left. Step number 2, we're going to square both sides. Step number 3 is solve. And then step number 4 is you're going to have to check all solutions in the original equation. So we're going to isolate the root on the left. We're going to square both sides, solve out that resulting equation, and then we're going to check all the solutions back in the original. A lot of times when you solve these, you'll get two solutions. They may both work, one may work, or in some cases, neither one of them work. So we'll work through a couple of these. We're going to go ahead and start with question 45, and this is on page 165. Okay, so what we've got is we've got x minus the square root of 2x plus 3 equals 0. Now what we want to do, since we have a square root, is we want to get this square root by itself. Now remember back in 1.4, how did we get rid of a square? We took a square root, right? So think in terms of opposites, how would we then get rid of a square root? We would have to square both sides. So I'm going to just go ahead and move this square root of 2x plus 3 over. And then I'm going to rewrite it so that my square root is on the left. And so I just rewrote it, moved it over, and then I just rewrote it so that my square root was on the left. So now we've got it moved over. Okay, how do we get rid of a square? What's the opposite of a square? A square root. So what's the opposite of a square root then? A square. So how are we going to finish this one out? We're going to have to square both sides. So go ahead and square both sides. Now, when you square a square root, what happens? When you square a square root, they go away. So that leaves you then with 2x minus 3 on the left and x squared on the right. So this is what we've got so far. Now we need to set this equal to 0. Okay, so look what happened here. Okay, we got to this step. Now how do we get rid of a square root? We square it. So when we square a square root, what's going to happen to it? They're opposites, so they cancel out directly. And whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So does that make sense what we did there? So all I did was I just moved this over and just put it back on the left where it belongs. So I rewrote it, squared both sides, and now I'm at this step. We need to finish it. So what do? We set it to 0 now. So move that 2x minus 3 over. And that leaves me then with x squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0. These should factor out nicely, okay, and it does. First times the last is a negative 3. Negative means we have one number positive, one number negative. Larger numbers negative, so we use a negative 3 and a positive 1. So that then factors directly into x minus 3, x plus 1 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, so x equals then what? 3. What about the other one? X plus 1 equals 0, so x then equals a what? Negative 1. Now, we are not completely done yet because we need to check both of these because chances are one of them is not going to work. And we check them back in the original. So we're going to check them back in x minus the square root of 2x plus 3 equals 0. And we're going to plug in each value. So we're going to plug in 3. Let's see if 3 will work. It's going to be 3 minus the square root. 2 times 3 plus 3. 2 times 3 is 6, plus 3 more makes it 9. And what do we know about the square root of 9? 3. And we know then that 3 minus 3 does in fact equal 0. So x equals 3 works. Now they might both work, so we have to check them both. So we checked x equals 3. Now we're going to check x equals a negative 1. And that is then minus 1. We plug it in. Minus the square root of 2 times a minus 1 plus 3. So that's minus 1 minus, okay, 2 times a negative 1, that's a negative 2. Plus 1 makes it the square root of 1. And that does not work because 1 minus 1 is not 0. That's a minus 2. And that clearly does not equal 0. So x equals negative 1 does not work. So what's the only solution that we have? The only solution that we have is x equals 3. So you solve it, you plug all those possible solutions back in the original. Let's do one more of these, and then we'll look at some different roots, some higher powered. So let's look now at, how about question 50? Again, this is on page 165. Question 50. We've got the square root of 6x plus 7 minus 9 equals x minus 7. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we need to get this square root by itself. So that means I've got to move that 9 over with addition. And then that leaves me with the square root of 6x plus 7 equals x plus 2. Is everyone okay with that? So all I did was slide those over. Now, how do I get rid of a square root? Well, how do I get rid of a square root? I square. So we're going to go ahead now and square both sides. When we square the right-hand side, that's going to make us FOIL. So on the right-hand side, we'll have to FOIL out x plus 2, x plus 2. So that's x squared plus 2x plus 2x, and 2 times 2 makes it a plus 4. That leaves you then with x squared plus 4x plus 4. And what's going to happen to the left-hand side? Well, when we square a square root, what does that do? When we square a square root, those cancel, don't they? So that's going to leave you then with a 6x plus 7. Now we should be able to go ahead and finish this by setting it equal to what? We're going to set this equal now to 0. So move that 6x over and that 7 as well. That then leaves you with x squared, a minus 2x, and 4 minus 7, that leaves you with a minus 3. So now all the square roots are gone. First times the last is a negative 3 again. And middle number is a negative 2. So we need a negative 3 and a positive 1. That factors then into x minus 3, x plus 1. And we're getting close here. We just need to go ahead and finish this out. What are my two solutions? Well, x minus 3 equals 0. That gives you x equals 3. It's one possible solution. And then x plus 1 equals 0 gives you x equals a negative 1 as another solution. Now, just because it's a negative does not mean that it won't work. You have to check it because it may or may not work. We're going to now check it back in the original. So we're going to check this in the square root of 6x plus 7 minus 9 equals x minus 7. And we're going to check both of these solutions. It could be that both of them work. It could be that neither one of them work. In this case, I think they'll both work, but let's check them and see. Let's check x equals 3. That's going to then be replacing the square root of 6 times 3 plus 7 minus 9. That equals then 3 minus 7. 6 times 3, that's 18. And 18 plus 7 makes it the square root of 25. And 3 minus 7, well, that's a minus 4. What do we know about the square root of 25? That's a 5. And then that leaves it with a minus 4 equaling a minus 4. So it does, in fact, work. Okay, so that's going to work out for that one. So that one does check out and work. Now we need to check the other one. And let's check the other one. The other one is x equals a negative 1. So we'll plug that in. And that's going to be the square root of 6 times a negative 1 plus 7 minus 9 equals a minus 1 minus 7. And let's see if these sides match up. So 6 times a negative 1, well, that's a negative 6 plus 1 makes it, plus 7 makes it 1 minus 9. The right-hand side is a minus 8 when we combine. And square root of 1 is 1, so that's 1 minus 9. And 1 minus 9 makes it a minus 8. The sides match. That means it works as well. So in this case, what do we know? In this case, we know that we have two solutions. We've got 3 and we've got negative 1. We checked them and both of them worked. Okay. Now what about higher roots? Let's look at one that's got a higher root. These are actually, in many cases, easier to work through. So let's look now at a couple of these. Let's look at question 68. So we're going to look at question 68. on page 166. And what do we have here? We have the cube root of 2x equals the cube root of 5x plus 2. This one is actually much easier than the last ones. So let's think about what we did a moment ago. When we had a square root, how did we get rid of a square root? We squared it, right? So what power is this? This is a cube root. So what do you think is the opposite of a cube root? Well, the opposite of a cube root would be a cube. So we're going to go ahead now and get rid of this cube root by cubing both sides. And when you cube both sides, that cube and that cube root, they cancel. So what is then left over? What's left over then is a 2x equals 5x plus 2. We don't even have to factor it. We can directly solve this by moving that 5x over. And that leaves you then with a minus 3x equals 2. We'll divide by our negative 3. And that leaves me then with x equaling minus 2 thirds. We need to go ahead and check it. Always have to check these roots. So let's go ahead and check this and see if we get the same answer on both sides. All we have to do is check and make sure the sides match up. So we're going to check this in. The cube root of 2x equals the cube root of 5x plus 2. And if it's going to be easier, you can use the decimal equivalent. So x equals minus 2 thirds. We're going to check that with a minus 0.667. It's going to be close enough. So if you need to check these, you can check them with the decimal approximation. All we're looking for is to make sure that the sides match up. We're not going to work these out completely. All we have to do is make sure they match up. Okay, so let's go ahead now and work on the left-hand side. So we've got 2 times a minus 0.667 when we round. Okay, that comes out to be a minus 1.334. The other side should be the same. Don't worry about taking that cube root. Just make sure the sides are the same. Well, the other side, what is it going to be? Well, if I work out the other side, just so we can see, on the other side we have 5 times a minus 0.667 plus 2. What do we end up with? A minus 1.335. They're going to be very close. They might be off by just a little bit, and that's because of rounding. So these are the same. They're off just by a little bit because of the rounding. So we plugged in our decimal, and we found that it does work. So what's the answer for this one going to be? Well, the answer for this question would simply be x equals a minus 2 thirds. So that's all you need to do is plug it back in. If you've got a fraction, just use the decimal equivalent. They're going to be very, very close to each other. They might be off just by a little bit because of rounding them. So if you've got a fraction, you don't have to plug the fraction in. Just use the decimal equivalent. Question 74. So question 74, we have the fourth root of x squared plus 6x equals 2. Okay. Now again, do not try to make this more difficult than it needs to be. We've got that root already isolated on the left. Now, it is a fourth root. So how do we get rid of a fourth root? We have to take both sides to the fourth power. So let's go ahead and work out 2 to the fourth. What would 2 to the fourth be? Well, 2 to the fourth is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, right? And that gives you then 4 and 4, which then makes it what? That makes it then 16. That fourth power and that fourth root, they cancel. So we now have x squared plus 6x, and that equals 16. Is that going right with that? Do we see what we did? We have to take it to the fourth power, and whenever you take a number to that fourth power, you can either use your calculator or you can just write it out and multiply. Either way, that should come out to be 16. What do we need to do? We solved a lot of these. We're going to move that 16 over. And now we are left with x squared plus 6x minus 16 equals 0. This is going to factor out very easily because we've got a minus 16. It tells us that one number is positive, one number is negative, larger number is positive, smaller one is negative. What two numbers will work? Well, how about 2 and 8? So we need a positive 8 and a negative 2. That factors into x plus 8 and x minus 2. Okay, and we're almost done here. So we've got it factored. What are my two solutions? Well, we've got x plus 8 equals 0. So move that 8 over, and that gives you x equals a negative 8. We've got x minus 2 equals 0. So x equals then 2. Now, we are not completely done yet, because what's the very, very last thing that we have to do? Well, the very, very last thing that we have to do is check. And we check them back in the original. I think both of them will work, but we still need to check them. So we're going to check them in. The fourth root of x squared plus 6x equals 2. So that's what we're going to check them in. Got to check them back in the original. So let's plug in that negative 8. And that's going to then be the fourth root of a negative 8 squared plus 6 times a negative 8. And let's see if that gives you a 2. Now, it should come out to be the fourth root of 16 because we know the fourth root of 16 is 2. So the left-hand side underneath that root is probably going to come out to be a 16. Well, 8 squared is 64. And let's see, 6 times 8, that's a 48. And 64 minus 48, well, that's a 16. And the fourth root of 16 is a 2, so it works. What about the other one? Other one that we came up with was 2. Let's check and see if 2 works. So we've got the fourth root of 2 squared plus 6 times 2. And that should equal 2. 2 squared is 4. 6 times 2 is 12. And that gives you then the fourth root of, again, 16. And the fourth root of 16 is 2. 2 equals 2. So both of these solutions do work. So my answer would be both of these because they both match up. But you, again, have to go back and check them. We've got a little bit of time left. We're going to look at another topic. We may not get through both of the next two topics in this section, but I want to at least get through one of them. We're going to now look at things that have multiple solutions. Let's see if I can't find one from our textbook here. Actually, I think I'll just make one up. It'll be easier if I just make one up for us. That way it's not as complicated as some of the textbook ones. So let's try and solve this out. Let's say x to the fourth. We'll use a negative. About 9 over here. And a positive 10x squared. Okay, so we're going to try and solve this one. Now, what's the difference between this and all the others that we've done? Well, this one, instead of having a square for the power, what does it have for the power? It has a 4. So that means that we're going to eventually have up to 4 solutions. We're going to find these solutions by factoring. So we're going to go ahead like we normally would, and we're going to set this to 0. So move that 9 over. And first times the last is a 9. Now, what two numbers are going to multiply together to give me 9? Add together to give me 10. Multiply together to give me 9. Add together to give me 10. Both are positive. This is very easy to factor. How about 9 and 1? Now, the only difference between this and all the others that we've done is when we go to break it down, instead of it being an x and x, this x to the fourth, that breaks up into x squared and x squared. And then we've got a 9 and we've got a 1. Now we are going to get 4 solutions total. We're going to get 2 from each one. Because these aren't x plus 9, this is x squared plus 9. So let's try to find our 4 solutions. So we set each separate part equal to 0. So x squared plus 9 equals 0. Move that 9 over with subtraction. And that leaves me then with x squared equals now a negative 9. And how do I get rid of a square? What's the opposite of a square? Okay, the opposite of a square is a square root. Add in your plus or minus. And that cancels out. That gives you x equals now. What's the square root of a negative 9? 1.3. When we talked about complex numbers. Square root of 9 is 3. It's negative, so it makes it 3i. So there's 2 solutions right here. What are my 2 solutions? 3i and a negative 3i. These are not difficult problems to solve. They just take a little bit of extra time. That's half of it. How do we get the other half? Now the other one is x squared plus 1 equals 0. We'll move that 1 over with subtraction. And that leaves us then with x squared equals now a negative 1. How do we get rid of a square? Again, we use a square root. Tack on that plus or minus. And what's the square root of 1? Well, the square root of 1 is 1. It's negative, so it makes it an odd. So that gives you then x equals plus or minus I. And so that means our two solutions are I and also negative I. And that's it. So on these, don't try to make them more difficult than what they need to be. We're going to do one more of these. And then we should have time for fractional powers as well. So let's do one more of these. The ones in the textbook are a little bit harder to factor, and so I'm giving you ones that are easier like your homework, because you only have one of these. Only one that I gave you is question 15. Trying to make it look very similar to question 15. So let's try and solve this one out. About x to the fourth. And then on the right, I'll use a 12. And how about we use a minus x squared in the middle? So again, a pretty easy one to solve here. Treat it like any other polynomial. What are we going to do? Set it to 0. So move that 12 over. That leaves me then with x to the fourth minus x squared minus 12x equals 0. First times the last is a negative 12. They always factor out nicely. The middle part is negative. So how about we use a minus 4 and a 3? Because those will work, won't they? Pretty easy to factor there. Now, when we factor it down, instead of it just being an x, what do we come down to? X squared. So that's going to be x squared and x squared, a minus 4 and a plus 3. We're still going to get 4 solutions. So let's go ahead now and get our four solutions. So we've got x squared minus 4 equals 0. So add on our 4. Now we've got x squared equals 4. How do we get rid of a square? Well, we take our square root, and whenever we take a square root, what do we add on? Plus or minus. So that leaves me then with x equaling plus or minus 2. So what are our two solutions? They're going to be 2 and negative 2. So there's half of it. What about the other ones? How do we get the other side, the other two? Well, x squared plus 3 equals 0. Move that 3 again over. And so now we have x squared equals a negative 3. We can get rid of our square by taking the square root. Add on your plus or minus. And we now have x equaling plus or minus I squared of 3. And so my solutions would be I squared of 3 and a minus I squared of 3. Now we'll look at a couple of these with fractional powers. I only gave you 2 of these in your homework. So we'll do a couple of these, and then that'll be it for this evening. So fractional powers, what we do is we clear out the fractions. So let me pick some of these from our textbook. Start off with a really easy one here. How about question 75? And this is on page 166. These look a lot more difficult than they actually are. Okay, now what we want to do is want to see if we can work with that 125. And we want to try to break down that 125. How does 125 break down? 125 breaks down to 5 and 25, and then 5 and 5. So this 125 is going to break up into 5 cubed. So whenever you have a problem like this one, look on that right-hand side and see if you can break it up. And we could break that 125 into 5 cubed, because 125 is a perfect cube. Now, how do we get rid of our fractions? Well, we want to get rid of the fraction here. So how can we get rid of it? We can get rid of it by taking both sides. We'll just do it in 2 steps. Both sides is a half power. That'll clear that fraction out because you got a 2 down below, just like you would any other fraction. Okay, so those can cancel, and that leaves you with an x cubed equals now 5 to the 6th power. And how do we get rid of that 3? We want to make it a 1 here. We want to make it a 1x here. So how do we get rid of that 3? We use a 1/3. Why are we doing that? Because 3 times a third. What's 3 times 1/3? Okay, 3 times a third is 1, and it's gone. So that's going to make the left-hand side come out to be x, because those could cancel. And what about the right-hand side? Well, 6 times a third. Okay, 6 divided by 3 is going to be what? 6 divided by 3 is 2. So that comes out to be 5 squared. And we know that 5 squared is what? 5 squared is simply 25. You've got one very, very similar to that in your homework. It's a little bit different, but close to it. Okay, let's try another one. Let's look now at question 86. We're going to look at question 86. If we have time, we'll do another one of these. If we don't, then this will be the last one. I think we should have enough time for maybe another one after this as well. So we're going to look now at question 86. And it's very, very similar to the one in your homework. Just a little bit different powers here. So 86, we've got 3 times x to the 3/4 power equals x to the 1/2 power. And we're going to try and solve this. Now the good thing about these is you don't have to check your answers. So once we solve them, we're done. We're not going to have to check them. We need to clear out our fractions. So just like we did a moment ago, we need to clear them out. Now 3 is not going to break down because 3 is already a prime number. We need to clear out our fractions. And what do we have for our fractions? Well, if we look at them, we have a 4 and a 2. So the least common denominator of 4 and 2 is going to be a 4, right? Okay, nothing new there. So we're going to have to take both sides to the 4th power. And that's going to clear out all of my fractions. What we do have to be careful of when we do that is this 3, because this 4 is going to be distributed through. So that 4 gets distributed through. So what we need on the left-hand side is we need 3 to the 4th. Well, 3 to the 4th power would be 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. because you're writing it out 4 times, and that's 9 and 9, and then that makes that then 81. So we now have on the left 81, and what happens to the 4's here? They cancel, and that leaves you with an x cubed. On the right-hand side, what do we have? We have half of 4. Half of 4 is an x squared. Does everyone kind of see what we're doing here? So we just had to take both sides to the 4th power because my fractions are 2 and 4 in the denominators. Now, when that 4 goes through, it's not 3 times 4, it's 3 to the 4th power over here. So then we write it out, and we have to take it to the 4th power, so write it out 4 times, multiply. Now what can we do? Well, we can set this to 0 and factor it. And what can we factor out? Well, it looks like these both have an x squared in common. So I'm going to factor out an x squared. And that leaves you with an 81x minus 1. Because that x squared can come out. We're going to get our 2 solutions. And what are they? Well, we've got x squared equals 0. So that gives you then x equals 0. Because what's the only number that you can square? And it's 0. That's 0. So the only number that will work there is x equals 0. What about the other one? Okay, what about the other one? Well, the other one is 81x minus 1 equals 0. So we're going to add 1. And so 81x equals 1. Divide by your 81. And my second solution is x equals now 1 over 81. I don't think we really have enough time to do another one. I think that should get us through the lecture for this evening, because we just don't have enough time to do another question. So we have now finished up 1.6. So your homework now is going to be 1.6. You'll need to do them all. And if you have not done so, please make sure that you give me your homework for chapter 1 through 4. So make sure I get those if you haven't already done that. And I'll have everything graded tomorrow. So tomorrow in the afternoon I'll be grading. So I'll have everything graded and updated in Blackboard for you. And if you just took your exam this evening, I'll have that graded tomorrow as well.